effects, all the rest. So, let's take a quick look at all the other effects. The perspective folder contains effects that allow you to distort the perspective. Here we can highlight such a useful effect as drop shadow. It can turn alpha information into shadows that will add extra volume to your videos. For example, I will create a title. Basically, it's an alpha video. There are built-in shadows in any modern titling program. For example, shadows can be made in the Effect Controls panel. But if you have an old titling program or the titles are made somewhere else, then we can additionally use drop shadow. An additional volume appeared. You can adjust it, increase its distance, make it softer. The soft shadow hasn't ruined anyone's work yet, but the hard shadow stands out too much. For example, if you have white or light titles, it will be a good solution. The shadow depends on the background. For example, we have a white title and white objects on the video that make the text less readable. If the text was smaller, it would be even more difficult to distinguish it on a white background. Sometimes it's not superfluous to add a small light shadow that makes the border between the title and the background. An additional contrast appears at the border and separates the text, so it becomes independent of the background. If we need to use a title, it partly depends on the background and is lost. In this case, we cut it off a little from the background with a soft shadow, but we can also use a harder shadow. It all depends on the task set. The fact is that we have such a function. Next, there are some cool tools in the Styles folder. For example, let's consider Find Edges. It highlights the borders of colored objects with colors. Where a color has a border, Find Edges additionally highlights it and paints the color that is in this border. In general, such an interesting drawn picture is created. That in principle can look good in different situations. The next effect is mosaic. If we need to create a pixelated image, we can use this effect. We can set the number of rows and vertical columns. It can be used as a transition, background for titles in many situations. If you animate mosaic, you can get this result. In general, this is not a bad thing. Posterize allow you to reduce the number of colors of the image. Only bright colors remain here. I wonder what it will look like with Find Edges. You may notice that the result is completely different colors due to the fact that I swapped them. It's for you to experiment and to play around. From the Styles folder, we can also consider Replicate, that creates a repeating multiscreen, which can also be combined with other effects, as desired. Dark colors and light colors are inverted in Solarize. There is a transition line from dark to light in Threshold. Everything that is dark is inverted, and everything that is light remains the same. Again, this is how a certain effect can be used. Next, we have some very good effects in the Time folder. For example, its echo. After a fraction of a second, it creates another frame that is superimposed on the video. This interval can be either increased or decreased. Also, you can change the number of echoes and the overlay style between these layers. It's very good to use it in situations. For example, when you are shooting a night time lapse, the headlights would be shot with a fairly long shutter speed. You'll be able to make a long overlay of headlights through the echo and through the overlay of several layers. That is, you won't have such frames, but through the echo operator added, it allows you to apply only the bright parts without affecting the dark ones. Everything dark remains the same, and the bright headlights begin to merge into solid long lines that, in general, look cool. Posterized time is a separate thing that reduces the number of FPS. If we remember, we drew the intermediate frames to avoid jerky actions. But here, on the contrary, we create this action, removing unnecessary frames. Let's say we have a frame rate of 24, but we can lower it to 5 or 8. It's quite an interesting clip effect. In addition, the speed remains unchanged. It's like we cut out unnecessary frames and throw them out with this effect, which is very interesting in principle. In the transform folder, we have important effects that you need to know the names of in order to be able to find them in the search, because we will use them all the time. The first effect is crop. It does a very simple thing. A certain number of frames we can separate from different slides. It also has a new zoom effect. And, of course, you can set the blur border. The crop effect is a term that exists in many editing programs and works the same everywhere. The point is that it separates a certain number of pixels on each side. Then you can finish the frame in any way. Edge feather adds a blur to the frame where there is none. For example, we will slightly reduce the scale of our video using the mount function to increase the edge blur. So we get this result. Next, we have horizontal and vertical flip. This is a universal thing. It's called flip, flop in various editing programs. Horizontal flip is most often used when, for example, you need to straighten the video in the direction of movement. We can see which effects are most often used on the effects panel. Horizontal flip has hardware acceleration, 32-bit space and YUV space, while vertical flip only has hardware acceleration, although in principle it performs the same functions. We can display service information per frame using the functions in the video folder. For example, there are timecode, simple text, clip name. Here we have things that don't edit any action by default. Transition has such a concept as transition completion. We can make a transition from one video to another using block dissolve. Here are blocks of 1 pixel that form a dust effect, and we'll make blocks by width and height of 50 pixels. There is a similar effect somewhere in the settings, but here, since this is an animated parameter, we can output this effect non-linearly. We will set transition completion to 0 and set it to 100 at the second point, although probably it won't be displayed here as well as in other places. So we have got a pretty good result. Gradient wipe is a gradient. This effect allows you to use a gradient from some video layer. Some video can become a mask that we will use to make the transition. It's necessary to put some gradient video on top. As you can see, it uses this video. Maybe if I disable it, it will be better as a transition. Let's go to other effects. It's linear wipe. Here you can make the same transition that I was talking about, flipping with a soft input. It's much better than there is in the transitions by default. The radial wipe is a radial transition. It's like what we did with the alpha channel, but less interesting. For comparison, I will show you what we can do with the alpha mask. Of course, it looks much more interesting than the radial wipe. And the last effect in the video folder is Venetian blinds. It creates the effect of louvers. We can also change these parameters and apply them every possible way. It can be quite interesting if we do it like this. Then we can have such an unusual transition. You should feel free to experiment, because Premiere has a very wide range of tools and extensive features that are much more than you might need. Sometimes some functions are not enough, but in general the potential is great. And this is very cool. In addition, something is constantly being added and updated that pleases. We are done with the effects. Let's go on to explore more interesting topics.